Thank you. I'm going to mention second question. Uh, it's a great pleasure to introduce our plenary speaker, Mr. Marc BRUNELLE from the University of Ottawa. Professor BRUNELLE is a renowned expert in phonetics, which is research focused total and the register of Southeast Asian language. And his work has significantly deepened our understanding of the language in its region. Today, Professor BRUNELLE will begin his talk entitled What Vibrant Phonetic Studies Reveal of Register and the Registrogenesis. We are excited to gain insights from extensive research and we will look forward to stimulating and enlightening session. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Marc.
Thank you for your introduction. And thank you for inviting me. This is a great opportunity. This is perfect timing as I'm wrapping up a 7-year project on registered languages of Southeast Asia. So I'm going to be able to present a little. Since there was considerable field work involved in this project, I had a long list of collaborators. Some of them are present in the room today. I would like to, besides my collaborators, I would like to thank the hundreds of participants who have patiently taken part in my experiments, even if they are sometimes really wondering what I'm doing, what's the purpose of doing it. I would also like to briefly acknowledge the important intellectual influence that Gérard Diclet and Michel Ferrus had on me. I still remember discovering their work at the University of Montreal Library in the early 90s. If it hadn't been for their work, I don't think I would have become a Southeast Asian. Okay, so some background first. If you're not a phonologist, maybe you don't know what register is. So register is a binary cue that is realized on the entire syllables and is composed of a bundle of acoustic features, voice quality, vowel quality, pitch, and some durational effects that are realized on the vowel, but that stem from an original voicing contrast in onset obsolescence. And onset obsolescence in Southeast Asia are typically stops. So you have a contrast between voice stops and voiceless stops. It's lost and a bundle of features develops on the entire syllable. I will not talk about related phenomena or similar phonetic phenomena that have been labeled pseudo-register here that have different sources. If you're interested in that, talk to Ryan in discussions. So I just want you first to listen to an example of a minimal pair that is distinguished by register in Eastern Jarai. Eastern Jarai is a Chamic language and was until recently assumed not to be registral, but it turns out it has. So in Eastern Jarai, you have a contrast between the syllable ta that comes from Proto-Chamic ta, that means we, inclusive we. Something like that. And then you have the word for chest that comes from Proto-Chamic da, that has lost its voicing and is now realized as yeah. Okay, it has vowel diphthongization and breathiness. So very salient contrast. Now, the acoustic properties that can be found in registers are the following. So this is what has been listed in previous literature. So first you have vowel quality differences, F1 and F2. So F1 is the most important cue by far, and it has to do with vowel height, right? So you typically have low on glides and closed vowels in the high register, and you have high on glides and open vowels in the low register. And then people have also reported some F2 differences, so frontis, vagueness, but they tend to be more variable, so we don't really know what's happening. Now, since vowel quality will be important in this talk, I want to show you the asymmetry between open and closed vowels here in this little table that contains data from Blue, an Austroasiatic language spoken in Thailand. And this is Hoffman's description of the language. So you can see that there are 9 proto-long vowels. preceded by a star, and that each of these vowels split into two series. In the high register that comes from voiceless stops, you see that closed vowels and closed mid vowels have a rise in diphthongization. So E becomes A, whereas in the low register, E remains E. The asymmetry is that open vowels, A and A, actually diphthongize in the low register and have a fall in diphthongization. So you can see that A turns into IA in the low register, or A into Ua. Okay, so the difference between the condition by vowels. You can also see that A here in group is patterning with closed vowels, but it's actually ambiguous. A patterns sometimes with closed vowels, sometimes with closed vowels. Now, in terms of the other acoustic properties of the register contrast, you have voice quality. I'm not going to get into all the technical measures that are used for voice quality at this stage, but you typically have a modal voice in the high register, and a breathy voice in the low register, okay? And you tend to have a high pitch or high at zero in the high register, a low pitch in the low register. And finally, as voicing is lost, sometimes some properties remain unconsonant. So the high register stops that come from voiceless stops are typically unaspirated, whereas low register stops that come from voice stops typically have a slight aspiration, not an enormous aspiration. Okay, so here's an example with spectrogram stop. So this is a minimal pair in trial. The left-hand panel is the word T, which means hand, high register, and the right-hand panel is the word P, which means ordinal and virtual marker, and comes from virtual T. So the subscript circle and so on. So first, you will hear the finalization of the high register. Oops, sorry. And in the low register, you get. So the first difference between the two spectrograms is that you can see that there's a higher at zero in the higher register syllable than the low register syllable. A second difference is F1 at the beginning of the vowel. You see that F1 is much higher in the higher register than the low register. Since F1 is inversely proportional to vowel height, this results in a rising diphthong at the beginning of. Then they have slightly more aspiration in the low register than the high register. You can see that there's a longer VOT low register. And then finally, voice quality is difficult to see in the spectrogram, but we still have some cues. So typically, voice quality has the effect of reducing the amplitude of upper frequencies. And this is what you see here. In the modal voice token, in the high register tokens, you have a modal voice, and you can see that the second format is quite distinct. But in the low register token, you can see that the second format is very faint because there's been a loss of energy. And you can also see that the vocal fold vibrations are more regular in the high register, in the modal voice. They have relatively regular vertical striations. Whereas in the low register token, you can see irregular striations. So these are cues to know. Now, there's a variety of cues that can be used in register languages. Not all languages use all these cues to the same extent. So our first point is that relative cue weights can vary. So some languages will use some cues more than others. So for example, in many languages of Thailand or in China, F0 is exaggerated in the register system. So you have a variety of cues, but F0 is really primary. But there's even some languages in which all cues have been lost but one. So for example, in Western and Northern Khmer, you tend to preserve pitch, but all the other cues are gone. So you have a two-way tonal contrast, practically. And this is also the case in Khmer. In Central Khmer, only vowel quality has been preserved, and all of the cues have been gone. So you now have an insanely complex vowel system with up to 34 vowels, but there are no more traces of the vowel quality, the voice quality. Now, when working on register, you typically rely on previous descriptions to decide what language you're going to study. But as we were conducting the project, we realized that sometimes auditory descriptions are not really accurate. There are some biases in descriptions. A first cause for these biases is the language background of researchers. So we have the funny feeling that, for example, Vietnamese and Thai linguists who speak tone languages tend to put too much emphasis on F0, tend to hear F0 as being more important than it actually is. Whereas Western researchers tend to put too much emphasis on vowel quality and on voicing, and tend to underemphasize voice quality and pitch. So this is something to take into account when looking at literature. And there, in older literature from the 70s to the 80s, there were also some descriptive limitations due to technical issues of the time. So, for example, it was very difficult to measure voice quality until maybe the 1990s. It was possible to make these measures, but it was so time-consuming, given the technology of the time, to make fine-grained measures that people would usually take one measure per vowel and would lose fine-grained information about the time course of. Another problem is that, keep this simple, performance and voice quality interact in close and close with vowels. So the reason is that if you have a very low performance, it boosts the amplitude of the harmonics, and it introduces distortion in voice quality measures. We now have formulas to compensate for this, but we didn't have them until the early 2000s. A lot of the previous literature tends to concentrate on low vowels, only makes vowel quality measures for A, for example, which means that we have bias. Okay, so we have many types of registered languages, tend to have different acoustic properties. So various researchers have proposed to establish stages of development of registered languages. And I'm going to use one proposal that dates back to 1976 and was made by Huffman. It has the advantage of being conceptually very clear, despite the fact that it is to a certain extent oversimplistic. So Huffman based himself on 15 Austroasiatic languages of Thailand. Here, he focused on vowel, and he made no acoustic measures. Basically, relied on auditory descriptions, but he has really good. The descriptions tend to match what we're finding. So what he proposed is that at an early stage, languages preserve a voicing contrast, so conservative languages will retain voicing and will have little to no vowel differentiation. Then there's a transitional stage where voicing starts to break down. You have devoicing and aspiration, and there are some subphonemic vowel differences that appear on following vowels to compensate the loss of voice. At the following stage, you have real registered languages in which vowel differences are primary and aspiration being subphonemic. And finally, some languages may go as far as to keep a single property and glottals. So Hoffman took Cambodian as his main example. So he proposes that there can be a split in the vowel system and that there is a constant content. So we'd like to revisit these stages based on state-of-the-art phonetic evidence. So what we've done in the past 7-8 years is not necessarily groundbreaking conceptually. It's very similar to what Acham Tirapang or Chulalongkorn did in the 80s or 90s in collaboration with Arthur Robertson. It's a survey of registered languages to try to see what their phonetic properties look like. But our technology is more up to date, and we chose a wider array of languages to try to see, to get a picture of the full diversity. So we looked at 10 languages. We have 2 conservative languages in which voice is maintained, Northern Uruguay and Eastern Europe. We have 1 language in which there is redundant registered voicing, the Nongolam, spoken in South Central Vietnam. We have 6 registered languages. They tend to be concentrated in Central Vietnam, and this is just a consequence of my own professional network. Okay, I'm not making any claims about these languages being special in any way. And then finally, we have 1 language in which only F0 was retained, Northern Khmu, spoken in my province in Thailand. So the questions we're going to ask is, what are the actual acoustic properties of register? And we're going to study registered languages at different stages, as we just saw in the previous slide. We're going to have acoustic measures, and we're going to have a fine-grained time resolution. So we may measure at every millisecond to be able to see how register properties change over the course of the vowel. And then at the end, I'm going to show you what the applications are for vowels and registrogenesis. Now, I conducted data on lots of languages, so I obviously can't present it. So I'm going to show you sample data, and you're going to have which I deem to be representative, but you're going to have to take my word for it. So if you're skeptical, most of the results have already been published for individual languages, and you can go read the available literature. You're going to have all the details about our results for individual cases. So we conducted production studies on the 10 languages that we were interested in, and we tried to use a relatively consistent methodology in all these languages. So we chose about 60 target words per language, and we picked words with 5 long corner vowels, E, E, A, A, U. And the reason for choosing these vowels is that we want to be able to see the asymmetry between high vowels and low. We combine these vowels with dental velar onsets. Why dentals and velars? Because dentals the dental place is the place that has the most possible onsets in all the languages we've studied. And we pick velars because the velar place is the one that has the fewest consonants. We tried to choose target words that were open monosyllables as possible in order to avoid the experimental confounds. And when it wasn't possible, we chose words with codas or word syllables that didn't contain very laryngally marked consonants. We made 2 types of recordings. So on the top picture here, you can see our acoustic recording session. We have 2 microphones. The microphone on the table, the very visible one, is actually the backup microphone. It's not a very good quality microphone. The good quality microphone is here next to the speaker's neck. Okay. And as we were recording audio, we also collected data with an EGG, an electroglotograph, to track the cycles of opening and closing of the glottis. So it's a simple technique. You put electrodes on each side of your participant's larynx, and you conduct a low-level electrical currents between the 2 electrodes. It's painless. It's less than 1 volt, you can see. If the glottis is closed, if the vocal folds are touching, conductivity is good, and you have a high electrical intensity. If the vocal folds are open, there's some resistance, so you have a low intensity. So this way you can track the cycle of opening and closing in real time. So we use that to detect voice. And we have at least 23 speakers per language, sometimes more. We have at least 10 men in each community, and sometimes we have up to 18 women. For some reason, it's much easier to recruit women than men in most communities where we work. I think it has to do with men spend more time in the fields, so they're not always. And we have a wide age range in all communities we work with participants from 18 to about 70. So I'm going to show you results right away. I'm going to start with consonants, with consonants. So what is the laryngeal setting that is used in the various languages? So I picked one language with conservative voicing, Martin or Vi, and you can see that in this language there is voicing as expected from previous literature. You can see that voiceless stops short like short, and that voice stops for the most part have closure voicing, negative DMT. So the vocal fold vibrations start before the release. However, there's a slight minority of voice stops that tend to pattern with voiceless stops. What's that? In order to understand this, we broke down the voice stops, the green stops, into 3 categories. You can see here. So these are 3 instances of the word Madame Rich produced by the same speaker. She has 3 possible. One variant has full voicing. You can see here that there's vocal fold vibrations throughout the closure. There's one realization with full voicing. You can see that there's no vocal fold vibration during the closure, except perhaps for the beginning. And this is just carryover voicing from the preceding vowel. This is just a chord acute. And finally, we have this voiceless release. We have voicing over most of the closure, but it breaks down towards the end, and then you have a slight positive unity that is similar to what you find. discordant. So this is unexpected to a certain extent. So we decided to do a breakdown by speaker of these types of voicing. So on this chart, you have female speakers to the left, male speakers to the right, and then you have the proportion of each type of voice stop they use. Male speakers, as you can see, massively use the voice stops, the fully voiced stops. But female speakers have a non-negligible proportion of voice stops with voices released. So it means that while they're still producing voicing to a certain extent, voicing is difficult for these female speakers, and there's partial voicing. Note that there's even one speaker who has full voicing in some cases, remains relatively large. So in Northern Rely, there is still a voicing contrast, but you can see that for female speakers, voicing seems to be difficult to make. Now let's look at the transitional language, monomonologue. So monomonologue has both voicing and stops and a register contrast. So when we look at its stops, you can see that the low register stops that come from voice stops have a bimodal distribution that is much more pronounced than what we found. The high register stops, the voiceless stops, have a short lag TFTs. So why? Because this very marked bimodal distribution. So when we look at individual speakers, we can once again see a difference between two genders. Male speakers tend to have voice stops, especially older males. Younger males towards the right of the chart have more voiceless release rates. So they produce voicing, but they have partial release. Female speakers, on the other hand, on the left-hand side, have a majority of tokens with a voiceless release with partial voicing, despite the fact that they maintain sometimes full voicing, and they sometimes have fixed. Look at the speaker here, F87. So this female speaker has so much devoicing that she doesn't rely on voicing more to realize the contrast. It seems that for this speaker, register is the key. Now let's look at languages that have full register systems. And I picked Southern Rely as an example. In this language, you can see that high register stops have the expected short lag TFT, whereas low register stops also have a short lag TFT, but it's a 5 to 10 milliseconds longer than the short lag TFT for high register stops. And there's also a few tokens that seem to have this. You can see those. So if we do the breakdown again, here you can see that female speakers massively devoice their voice, except perhaps one old speaker. Whereas male speakers prefer fully voicing, but maintain residual voicing in a significant proportion of times. And this is what we find with quote slight variation in true and Shroud, Eastern July, and Western July. So it seems that when you have a register contrast, it's important to look at the consonants, which most people haven't done until now, because there's often some residual cues on consonants. Now let's turn to the cues realized in times. So we're going to start with F0. And since F0 is a cue that has received the most attention in the literature, I'm going to show you data from 5. So what you have here on the x-axis is the vowel, the time course of the vowel. And then the two curves represent the first two columns, the voice stops and the voiceless stops. So for Northern Rely and Eastern Blue, voice stops are in blue, and the vowel following voiceless stops is in blue. In Northern Rely, you can see that right after voice stops, you tend to have a rising at 0. Okay, which seems to be co-articulatory with the voicing you have in consonant. In Eastern Blue, you have a similar pattern but weaker. You see that the purple line F0 after voiceless stops tends to be higher than F0 after voiceless. Okay, this is not surprising. This is what we find in every language in which this has been studied. This is the case for Dutch, for French, for English, for German, regardless of the actual implementation of the voicing contrast. So this is not surprising. When we turn to register languages like Western July and Shra, we find variation. I picked Western July here because you can see that for all vowels, F0 seems to be equivalent in the high and the low register. There is overlap. Orange, you see it as orange or red? Orange, okay, the orange and the green line. So overlap for all the vowels except for A. And in ah, we're finding the opposite pattern of what we would expect. We're actually finding higher F0 for the low register than high register. In tra, you have a slight difference between the two registers. The high register seems to have a higher register for E, U, and A. And then there's not much difference for the two open vowels. By contrast, Northern Cebu, which is no longer registral, which has developed a two-way contrast, has very clear tones. You can see that there is a strong F0 difference between the two series throughout the line. So Northern Cebu is free. Let's now turn to voice wall. So in our work, we're making lots of measures of voice quality. We have 6 indicators. I'm not going to show you all 6 indicators. I'm going to pick one. The one that seems to be strongest across languages, H1 minus H2. So it's a measure of spectral slope, or the amount of energy in low frequencies relative to high frequencies. So H1 is the first harmonic, the amplitude of the first harmonic. H2 is the amplitude of the second harmonic. What you need to know if you're another phonetician is that if H1 minus H2 is high, you have a breathier voice, and if it's low, you have a more voice. So let's look at the pattern in Northern Rely, a language that still preserves a voice context. What you can see is that the blue and the purple line overlap in all vowels. So you don't have a voice quality contrast when you preserve the voice context. The vowels, you have a similar phonation. In Western Jurai, you can see that a difference has emerged. The low register stops in green are followed by a breathier phonation than the high register stops in orange. And this is true for 4 vowels. So also note that the difference in breathiness is much more pronounced right after the consonants than it is further into the vowel. And you have something similar in Shroud, but in Shroud the difference is even more pronounced. So phonation or voice quality seems to be a strong cue of breathiness. Then let's look at vowel quality, and then you're going to get a pause. This is the last slide, technical with measures. No, there's 2 more. So you can see in Northern Rely that F1 differences are emerging in some vowels. Right? So if you look at open mid and open vowels, you can see that the blue line, F1 following voice stops, tends to be lower at the beginning of the vowel than the purple line, which represents F1 following voice stops. Okay? So this means that you have a rising diphthongization in the low register of open vowels. In closed vowels, E and U, you don't find that much. Okay, and this is even before voicing is lost. If you look at Western Jurai, the trial, you see that the difference is greater. So the languages that already have contrasted register, you can see that there is a much stronger breathiness. No, not breathiness. You can see that there's a much higher F1 in the high register than in the low register. But you can see that these differences are greater in open and open mid vowels than they are in high vowels. Something similar in Shroud. In Shroud, the difference is actually significant for all the vowels, but it's very small in E and U. So the difference is about 50, 75 hertz, which is minimal, but should still be audible in perfect circumstance. There's not too much background noise and you can pay attention to the stimulus, you should be able to. Okay, so finally, last acoustic measurement, F2. So vowel frontness or backness. There's not that much going on, but overall, it seems that you have a higher F2 following voice stops or in low register stops. The only exception here is that I find some centralization of open vowels in following voice stops in Northern Rely. You can see here that the blue line is lower for egg in the following voice stops, so the vowel is produced more posteriorly, and in up, the vowel following voice stops is more fronted. Now, I don't believe this is related to register, or not entirely related to register, because in Northern Rely, there was a merger between open mid and closed mid vowels. So I would like to tell you this is registral, this would be great, but I think there's. So in the end, F2 is not a variable. Okay, so if you feel overwhelmed by all the data I've given you, I have a little summary slide so that that you can read. So I picked one language for each stage of the register. So obviously we didn't measure all vowels, otherwise we would have torture or in Northern Reply, the language with conservative voicing, you can see that there is emergent vowel dephonization in the high register and following voice stops and for high vowels and following voice stops for low vowels. There is also a pitch difference in the low register, but there are no voice quality. In Manon, a language that is transitional, you can see that the diphthongization pattern is even stronger, and you can see that there's a breathiness difference or voice quality difference between low and high register vowels, but no pitch. Trao is a language that has a very strong register contrast, so it has vowel diphthongization, breathiness, and a low pitch in the low register. And in Northern Kru, the language that has gotten rid of all the cues besides the 0, you have a total contrast, so pitch is the only cue that's on. Okay, now, this is an oversimplification, and I'm just showing you data from 4 languages. So I decided to find a way to show you more complete data, more complete pictures of all 10 languages. Okay, so brace for impact, it's going to be okay, so what I decided to do is to calculate the informativeness of each acoustic property by looking at the separability between the acoustic properties of registers. So look at this chart here, and the acoustic indicator, the statistical indicator I'm using is called the code Z. So if you look at this distribution here, imagine that the blue bell curve represents low register dominance, and that the red bell curve represents high register dominance. The acoustic property is on the x-axis. It could be F0, F1, or voice quality. Now, what's important is that if the two distributions, the low and the high register, do not overlap very much, you have a high separability for an acoustic property, and therefore you could say that it's very informative and could be used contrastively. So this would be a code Z of about 3, which is large. Whereas if the two distributions overlap a lot, either because they have very close means or because they have very wide standard deviations or large variation, you're going to have smaller code Z because the acoustic cues of the two registers won't diverge that much. They tend to overlap. Okay, so high code Z, very high acoustic weight or high separability. Low code Z, low acoustic weight or low separability. Now, I'm representing the code Z's here for the non-Lebanon on this chart. You have all the participants for the x-axis, and you have the code Z on the y-axis. If a value is in the gray zone, has a code Z of less than 1, it means that it's not very informative. If it's above the gray zone, it means that it is very distinctive or very informative. So in the long run here, you can see that most speakers, most male speakers, have a very high weight for VOT, the green symbol. Okay, so they could probably rely on the VOT to realize the contrast, whereas female speakers have a low weight for VOT, their little symbols are increased. By contrast, if you look at F1, the little circles, the little targets, purple targets, you can see that all participants that you have relatively high potencies are around 2.5 or 3. And if you want to look at an acoustic property that has very low informativity, you can look at the little orange stars that are almost always in the gray. So this is an acoustic property that plays a very low. So what I did is that I got averages across participants for each language, and I represented them as a heat map. So for this heat map, you have the 5 acoustic properties I'm interested in. You have the languages we've studied, and they're grouped into 3 categories: Eastern Khmu and Northern Khmu voicing. A bunch of register languages at various stages, and then Northern Khmu total. And if the corresponding box is dark green, it means that it's very informative. If it's gray, it means that it's not informative. So what do we find overall? So in languages that still have a voicing contrast, like Eastern Khmu and Northern Reply, you can see that VOD is very informative. That's our problem. But what's interesting here is that there seems to be a fairly high residual growth for VOT in many register languages. Okay, and another element true it's still very high. Looking at the F1, you can see that some differences seem to be developing in F1 even before voice contrast is lost. But these differences increase in register languages and become more important. You can see that they're especially important in Chinachu and voice quality is not always present in languages that preserve the voice in contrast, but you can see that it plays some role in market reply. And that this difference in voice quality between the two registers gradually develops as voicing is lost. F2 is not significant in languages with that preserve the voice in contrast, but is in languages that have register. It's not an important cue, it's relatively weak. And F0 is all over the place. You can see that in languages that still have voicing, F0 has a significant weight, but that in register languages, F0 can be preserved or can be lost depending on the language. And obviously, Northern Q is a total language. So F0 is the dominant Q, and in fact, the only Q. Okay. I also conducted perception studies. I think you've had enough results, so I simply don't have time to present. So you can see the results in our published work. The results are largely available, but overall the results match production, which is not too surprising. F1 and voicing have large effects. Voice quality is weaker but important, especially in closed vowels, because in closed vowels, F1 is not playing a very strong role, and F2 and F0 are specific to a strong set. So what did we learn? So first, register still has consonant-like properties. So voicing is often preserved as a secondary cue. And then the acoustic cues of register that are realized on the vowel tend to be contrasted just after the stop. Okay, they tend to be concentrated close to the consonant. So it seems that register is still very segmental in some ways. Maybe it hasn't become a suprasegmental property like in languages which I see. When we look at vocalic properties, we see that not all cues are. So in our sample, all register languages seem to prioritize F1 or ungliding. Now, it's not the case with all register languages. I've worked, for example, at Eastern Cham, in which F0 is obviously the primary property. So I think it's perhaps coincidental, but there is probably a higher likelihood that F1 is going to play a role than other. Voice quality is secondary in all register languages, but it's still present. And it plays an important role in closed vowels, because in closed vowels, the F1 difference is relatively minimal. So the fallback cue is inflammation, and F2 and F0 are more language specific. So what seems to be important here is that in languages that preserve a voice in contrast, voicing affects the F0 of the following vowel, and F1 can be significantly affected in voicing. So we find this in Eastern Mu, we find that in the Northern Rely, and this was also found by Sima Smatbong in her dissertation in another dialect of Eastern. But what's crucial here is that when you still have voicing, voice quality doesn't seem to be very salient. You don't have differences in voice quality that are conditioned by voicing. So this suggests that there are maybe two independent mechanisms involved in registrogenesis. A mechanism by which F1 and F0 develop even before voicing is lost, and another mechanism that develops the phonation contrast, the voice quality contrast, as voicing is lost. So what could be these mechanisms? So the first mechanism would need to be an articulation that is associated with onset voicing and that affects F1 and F0. And then there's been some discussion in the literature of that question, and most people seem to agree that that would need to be a mechanism that is used to favor voicing in difficult conditions. So when you produce voicing in a sonnet, you have a full opening in your mouth. You push air pressure out of the lungs into the oral cavity, and your vocal folds are touching. So as air flows through the vocal folds vibrate, which produce voicing. If you want to produce voicing in an obstruent, it's much more difficult. You have and it's called the aerodynamic voicing constraint. This is a term designed by John. The problem, if you see on the slide, is that you have a full closure. So as you push voicing out of your lungs, it flows through the glottis and it goes into the oral cavity. But then air pressure builds up in the oral cavity, and at some point, the air pressure in the oral cavity and the subglottal cavity are equal, and then the transglottal airflow stops, which means that voicing is lost. So it is difficult to maintain voicing in obstruents. It's difficult to maintain voicing when you have a closure in the mouth. So for this reason, we know that in most languages that have been studied, people have an additional strategy to maintain voicing. So in French, Spanish, English, and in Dutch, there are two strategies that are used that could be useful for my purposes. The first one is to advance the tongue root. If you move the tongue root forward, you basically enlarge your pharynx, and you can accommodate more air in your pharynx, meaning that you can maintain voicing longer. That would account for vowel quality differences in register systems, right? Because if you move the tongue root frontwards, you're also affecting the tongue tip and the production of vowels. But this doesn't seem to be an explanation for the F0 differences. The second strategy is to lower the larynx. If you lower the larynx, you compress the air in the lungs, and then you can accommodate, you have much more air in the oral tract, meaning that you can preserve voicing longer. Now, larynx lowering could affect the two acoustic properties we're interested in here, F0 and F1. How does it affect F0? It's been discovered about 20 years ago that when you lower your larynx, there is a rotation between your trichoid and your thyroid cartilage, because the spine is not perfectly straight. And as you lower the cartilage of the larynx, the vocal folds get shorter. Shorter vocal folds are less dense, so produce a lower pitch. In terms of F1, the basic idea is that when you lower the larynx, your tubes, your supraglottal tubes get longer, and when your supraglottal tract gets longer, it automatically has the effect of lowering phonetics. So lowering the larynx could have an effect on that. So it seems that larynx lowering is a good candidate for the primary property that would lead to the development of F1 and F0 contrast that are transphonologized when voicing is lost. What about the second mechanism? So the second mechanism gives rise to a voice quality or breathiness distinction as voicing is lost. Where does it come from? So what our results show is that voicing tends to be more difficult for women, and voicing is more often lost in women than in men. Right? So that's something interesting. And a parenthesis is that typically sound change is led by women. Right? So if women tend to lose voicing, that could explain how register arises. Women first have a hard time producing voicing and start having partial devoicing. Their children hear it and try to reproduce the same acoustic outcome, so produce less and less voicing at each generation. And gradually you lose the voicing contrast in the language, just because women typically in most societies still raise children. Now, why do women have a harder time producing voicing than men? Because women have thinner vocal folds than men on average. So, because they have thinner vocal folds, they have a harder time maintaining a closure to the two vocal folds when they produce voicing. And this is what it looks like. This is called a glottal chink. Okay, you have a slight opening in the posterior area. So the glottal chink would be responsible for the loss of voicing, but it could also be responsible for the development of the voice quality contrast, because if you have a glottal chink, you have low-level turbulent airflow that flows through the glottis as you try to produce voice. So this could be a source of breathiness. Okay, so let's revisit Huffman's stages of registrogenesis with what we discovered. So constructed languages would be languages in which there is still voicing once it stops. And then my hypothesis that this voicing could be maintained because of larynx lowering. And then this would affect F0 and F1 at the beginning of the vowel, so right after it stops. In transitional languages, voice stops have a voiceless release, so voicing starts to break down, especially in women. And then the glottal chink would cause the aspiration of the while the differences are already present in F1 and F0, the previous stage gets phonologized. Then in register languages, voicing becomes a secondary cue and register is transphonologized, and the unwinding and resonance become contrasted. And F0 differences are language specific. Some languages could preserve them, some languages could lose them. And note that I don't believe there is such a clear cutoff between transitional languages and register languages. It's always very great. Finally, in restructured languages, a single property is preserved. This is not something that has to happen. This is something that can happen. So one property could be selected like in central command. Vowel quality has been selected at the expense of all of the properties. We have good cases for restructuring in terms of voice quality and in terms of F1 and in terms of F0, but we don't have very good cases of restructuring in terms of voice quality in F2. And this is a good question. Why does it happen? Perhaps it doesn't happen because the voice quality and F2 differences are simply not salient enough to be found. Okay, so where does Northern Q fit in all this? There are two possibilities. So why does Northern Q has a simple F0 contrast, pitch contrast driver, and complex register system? So of course, possibility is that it never had a register in the first place. First possibility is that the F0 variation or modulation that are conditioned by co-articulation from voicing were just transphonologized into a pitch contrast directly. Now that has long been believed not to be possible. Recently, Thurgood proposed a reanalysis of the registrogenesis in which he's claiming that it has to be mediated by voice quality. But since then, we have two cases where we can see tonogenesis in real time by looking at evolution through generations in Central, Malgache, and in Afrikaans. And in these two languages, we see tonogenesis going straight from voice without any other. The other possibility is that Northern Q underwent the whole chain of registrogenetic genetic development, and that it only kept at zero at the end. And this is the scenario put forward by Suilan in 2004. Another phonetic neural folks. So what are my steps? So I'm proposing that larynx lowering plays an important role in the incipient development of registrogenesis. But I don't have that much hard evidence for it. So I decided to look for that evidence by investigating the vertical movement of the larynx in some languages. And we're going to do this, we started doing this with ultrasound technology. So basically what you do is that you take an ultrasound probe and direct it towards the larynx, and you get an image that is a little murky like this spreadsheet. But you can still distinguish some articulators, some cartilages of the image. You have the shadow of the cartilage, the shadow of the cartilage, and in between you have the particle found. So what we're doing is that we're comparing two images at two time points. We started the closure and the end of the closure here, and we're looking at the movement of individual pixels in a grid using a technique called optical slope that was developed for looking at volcano plumes and the displacement of gas and vapor, but that is also used for special effects in the movie industry. And then this shows us that the pixels tend to move downward, so we can quantify. So we conducted an experiment in Japanese speakers. We picked Japanese because it's the only register language for which we have a significant number of speakers about. And then Japanese stops have been described as a tense lax contrast, but it's functionally equivalent to a high register and a low register, and it has the same historical source. So I'm going to show you data here from the word batak that has a tense stop, which is a high register stop, and the word adas that has a low register stop, which is spelled D in Japanese romanization. So I'm going to go through a sequence starting from the first A. Then I'm going to show you the closure, the T, and you're going to see the images for orange while I'm looking at the stop. And then I'm going to look at the final vowel, the last A. So you can see that during the initial A, the larynx seems to be raising to a certain extent. And then during the closure, it remains stable. And that after the closure, the larynx is going down to a certain extent. In the low register stop, you're going to see that the larynx is moving down during the first vowel. You can see it go down. It keeps going down during the production of the closure. And then it goes back to its original position in the following vowel. So we can detect vertical movement. And what we find is that, okay, fine, there's larynx lowering and lax stops or low register stops in but all speakers to a certain extent, and frequent larynx raising like this. So we can use the same technique to look at lingual movement to see if it's possible that the tongue root is involved. And here in this image, you can see the root of the tongue and the tongue tip. So I'm going to show you the sequence for the high register stop, and you're going to see that the tongue root is not moving very much. Okay, so you can see the tongue tip fronting, but the tongue root remains relatively stable throughout the sequence. The tongue tip goes back to its original position. Whereas in the low register stop, you're going to see the tongue root move frontwards. So you can see it fronting past the tongue. And then after the register, the tongue goes back to its default. Okay, so we find some evidence for tongue fronting in some speakers, but it's not necessary. Okay, time is up. So basically, what I'm showing you that right after this conference, we're going to Vietnam, and I'm going to conduct ultrasound studies on two dialects of Reply. Northern Reply that has conservative voicing, in which we predict we're going to find larynx lowering. We're going to turn out to be wrong. And Southern Reply has a full-fledged register. Voicing is lost in this dialect to a large extent, so we wouldn't expect to find as systematic regional lowering. Thank you.